This episode is brought to you by my free 3-part video series, FAM 101. Discover how to chart your cycles by tracking the 3 main fertile signs: cervical mucus, basal body temperature, and cervical position, and ultimately develop body literacy by paying attention to your fertile signs. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAM101 to grab your free copy. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM101. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 210. Welcome to the 210th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the Fertility Awareness Method and all things fertility. I've got a great episode for you today. I'm really excited to share my interview with Jane Knight. And so if you're not familiar with Jane, she is the author of the book, The Complete Guide to Fertility Awareness. And so she's a fertility awareness educator who resides in the UK. And it's really great to have the opportunity to interview women all over the world who are doing very, very similar work. So essentially doing the same work to educate women about the connection between their fertility and their health, and also to really help women gain confidence in using fertility awareness effectively to prevent pregnancy. And so those are 2 things that I'm extremely passionate about, as you know, from listening to the podcast. Really passionate about really just showing women that there is this deep connection between their fertility and their health, because that's not something that's a really common idea that's presented to us by our culture, that our menstrual cycle serves a purpose other than making babies. And so I think it's really important to know that. But the other part of it is that you can use this method that has no side effects because it doesn't change anything in your body. It's an observational method. So you're just watching your fertile signs, getting a really good sense of which days in your cycle are fertile, which days are not, and then using that to avoid pregnancy. And so there are standardized methods that have specific rules to help you not only to use the method successfully, but to be really confident while you're using it. So you're not like worried that you're going to get pregnant. You're actually confident because you understand how it works. So I'm super passionate about that, as you know. So you're going to enjoy today's episode. And if you are looking for additional support to learn the method, if you're at the stage where, you know, you're using it and you're feeling okay about it, but there's still certain things, like it's usually cervical mucus is the most challenging part for most women. Cervical position is another challenging part. And so every time I run a group program, we spend a lot of time talking about mucus. We spend a lot of time talking about cervical position to the point that everyone can feel really comfortable and confident with both of those areas. And of course, temperature is another one. So it seems like the most straightforward of the signs, but there are a lot of nuances to temperature. So if you are in the thick of it and just want to fast track your progress, so you could just, get to the point that you feel confident, know that at the end of the 10-week program, you'll be there. Make sure to join us. So this is basically like the last call. So at the time of release, we are starting next week. So if there are still spaces available, head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program. If there are spaces available, you will see the apply now button. And if there are no spaces available, I'm recording this about a week ahead of time. So if there are no spaces available by the time this episode airs, you'll see like a waiting list tab instead of the apply now. But we still have a spot for you at the time I'm recording this. And so I'd love to have you in there. So head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program, and let's get you to the point that you feel really confident in using this method for birth control, so that you can be really, really comfortable and confident knowing that it's your choice to use this. You don't have to feel like you need to go on hormones in the future, because you can actually feel really comfortable and confident with this method. And with that said, let's jump into today's episode with Jane Knight. And I'm very excited to welcome my guest, Jane Knight, to the podcast today. Jane is a fertility nurse specialist with over 30 years experience teaching fertility awareness in both NHS, National Health Service in UK, and private practice. She was the UK principal investigator for the European multi-center study on the probability of conception on different days of the menstrual cycle. Jane is the Director of FertilityUK, a national fertility awareness service which provides factual information and support for general health, education, planning, and avoiding pregnancy using a combination of fertility indicators. Fertility UK also offers training for health professionals in the UK and internationally. Jane has also authored several books, including The Complete Guide to Fertility Awareness. And in today's show, we're going to be talking about the fertility awareness method, bashing some of the myths around it that are still alive and well, and also talking about the implications of using this natural birth control method for women. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Jane.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I really wanted to have you on the show after grabbing a copy of your book, The Complete Guide to Fertility Awareness. Upon receiving the book, I thought, wow, what an incredible undertaking this must have been. So I would love to hear about how you first became involved in fertility awareness and began teaching it, and what inspired you to take it upon yourself to write that book, which was an incredible amount of work.
Okay, I guess it goes back quite a way, actually, to my days as a midwife. I started off in nursing and then went into midwifery. So we're looking back into the 1970s here. And during that time in midwifery, literally as midwives, we were taught very much that basically we had to cover all methods of contraception. But what we were told about fertility awareness was that the safe period was not safe. And that was the only thing that was basically stated. So to avoid it at all costs. And as midwives, we were absolutely to discourage any use of the so-called safe period, or I suppose at the time it was very much the start of temperature method. And it sort of didn't make sense because we'd spent a long time doing a lot of physiology and looking at the menstrual cycle. And I still didn't really I struggled to grasp the menstrual cycle until, as it happens, towards the end of the course, we were actually given an article to look at by an American gynecologist, actually by the name of Hannah Klaus. And this was an article about the Billings Method. And in it, she described basically the way the whole Billings Method worked. And suddenly the menstrual cycle completely made sense to me. And I thought, well, this just doesn't somehow, the two don't marry, this idea that we have to give a very detailed look at the menstrual cycle and understand all that to get through the midwifery exams. And yet at the same time, we're saying, don't trust the menstrual cycle. So I started to look into it a little bit more and managed to get in contact with a GP in Oxford who was Elizabeth Clubb at the time. So this was back late 70s. And at that time, Elizabeth was actually a Catholic doctor, and she'd been teaching for many years in general practice, mostly to Catholics, but basically to anyone, and using temperature method and a little bit of cervical secretions as well. So a little bit of combined indicators, if you like. And then she took me on to do some extra teaching with her because she was getting a lot of people that were coming into this purely for health reasons, health and ecological reasons, rather than as a method based on, to fall in line with Catholic Church teaching. So it really went from there, I guess, that I started working with her, training with her, and then started working in general practice in Oxford.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's a really interesting journey that you had. It's so interesting being a midwife in a profession that's so focused on supporting women, and to still have that conflicting information about the menstrual cycle. So on the one hand, you're learning that it's a valid thing that you can trust, and on the other hand, you're being told not to trust it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, and I think it really goes to as more and more women discover fertility awareness and become more comfortable with the menstrual cycle and recognize that you can use charting your cycles as a way to avoid pregnancy, it becomes more apparent that most health professionals are not taught this at all, and are actually, exactly as in your case, are taught the opposite.
Yeah, I think it's moved on. I'd like to think it's moved on a lot. I think it's moved on a little bit, but still, I mean, following on from my midwifery, I went in and did my my sort of sexual health, contraception, sexual health nursing. And again, as part of that, we were told really not to trust it, and that it was just about okay if somebody really didn't mind getting pregnant, was the kind of the gist behind it. So again, I started realizing there was an awful lot of nurses and doctors that were teaching or able to provide all methods of contraception. And I developed a special interest in fertility awareness methods purely as a method of choice. There's not saying this method is superior to another one or trying to run down contraception at all. It's much more about saying this should be something that's available, and we should look at all the facts in the same way that we try to find the facts and the evidence behind all different methods of contraception.
Mm-hmm. Well, and tell me about how the book came about. So, at what stage of your journey through all this, through fertility awareness, learning for yourself, and at what stage did you decide to write the complete guide to it?
Essentially, we started off, we wrote a book called Fertility. The first edition of that was 1986. And the real reason for that was because we realized that sitting in a general practice setting, we had relatively little time to give to women or couples. And a lot of this we realized could have been done through self-learning. So we started developing a lot of sort of teaching aids and sort of fact sheets, take-home materials and so on. And then realized that this kind of became a book. It just evolved. So we just got a publisher, published the whole thing, and it was a book basically for the general public. So it really evolved out of a need to provide written information for teaching. And then that went into its third edition by the mid-90s, was quite a successful book. And then really, I think that although that book was generally aimed at the user or the new user, you could say, it was very much then thought that a lot of health professionals were reading it. And the reason that I went on and developed the complete guide was realizing that it actually needed a little bit more meat still to convince health professionals that actually this is a genuine method based on good science. Mm-hmm. So that's how that evolved. So it has been quite a work of art. Yes, it's probably taken me 5 years in total to get to that stage of getting it published through Routledge. I was commissioned to do that, and we take it from there.
Mm-hmm. I can appreciate 5 years sounds about right. For the project. So when you were talking about that, you said, I felt like I needed to add a little bit more meat to convince the health professionals a little bit more. Talk to us a little bit about that aspect of it. So the women who listen to the podcast regularly are now quite familiar with fertility awareness, at least the majority. So many women discover the podcast here and there. So this may be the first episode that a lot of my listeners are hearing. So one of the challenges that many of the women, in the world face when we discover fertility awareness is that there's so much skepticism about it. And even in this day and age, people really just don't think it works and it is effective. So what is your first kind of line of defense around that? How do you address that myth that fertility awareness is not effective?
I think, first of all, you've got to realize that the effectiveness of it is dependent on so many variable factors. It's dependent on the woman herself, her menstrual cycles, it's dependent on cooperation of her partner, it's dependent on who is actually teaching her, what method is being taught, the guidelines that are being used, the evidence behind those. I think when you start and look then at studies and the way that the studies are conducted, the studies have different ways of evaluating pregnancies, analyzing whether they're intended or unintended pregnancies and so on. So there's this vast ocean of difference in relation to the effectiveness, if you like, and the motivation behind it from clients themselves, from women couples themselves, but also from actually what's being taught, what methods being taught. And I think this is where we get into so many people with so much confusion behind the different indicators, if you like. And what I've tried to do with the complete guide is to sort of start off basically in the first chapter, looking right through the sort of history behind how all the different indicators have evolved. And in actual fact, the calendar method itself was actually a pretty effective method, provided the criteria were strictly adhered to. But the problem was that so often it was used very kind of much more randomly. So in other words, not taking consideration of actual cycle length and so on. So there's been so many reasons as to why methods have failed. And I think the other concern that I have is that where only one method in other words, if someone is just teaching one method, for example, just a fertility awareness-based method, often becoming so enthused by that method that actually not recognizing that the woman who is actually asking to use the method may actually not be suitable for her, either for medical reasons, for reasons of different medications that are being used, for the relationship issues, or whatever else it is. So it is really important that it is actually matched in to that woman, and that all things are considered as to whether this actually is an appropriate method or an appropriate time for her to learn the method.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to tap into that a little bit more. So you may be aware that, so I'm trained in a specific method. I was certified in the Just East method. And through the podcast, it's been a really great opportunity to connect with, individuals who are working in the field of fertility awareness, but not in the same field. I know that you've probably experienced a little bit of this as well, but my experience has generally been that everyone kind of finds their little camp. I teach this method and I do this thing. And we all kind of stick in our camp, and then often kind of sometimes to some extent downplay what other people are doing. So kind of like my method is good and it's the best. And then, these other methods aren't as good. So share with me just a little bit more about that concept of recognizing that there are a lot of different ways to chart, a lot of different methods, and why certain methods may be more suitable than others for women.
It is such a tricky one. I suppose if we look at extremes, for example, many different organizations, some would be teaching single indicators, for example, just secretions, such as Billings or the sort of NAPRO technology type approach. Others would be teaching a combination of indicators. But even within that combination, there's a combination of different actual indicators and different ways that they're combined and different guidelines that they use. So I think would be wonderful if we could all get away from this idea of just giving a method a name based on whoever has sort of come up with it at that stage in history, and actually rather looking back at the roots behind the facts behind the different indicators and how they can be combined most effectively. So it's not really wanting to run down, and I don't think we should be running down one method or another, but this I think is where certainly health professionals find it incredibly difficult, because the whole fertility awareness and natural family planning world seems to be at war. And this is really difficult because it's almost like it's this other whole world that it's very easy to see why professionals just kind of rubbish it, because it's like they haven't even got any agreement between themselves. They're all arguing their own pitch. And you don't get that. If somebody's prescribing a pill, they base it on how much estrogen, how much progesterone and stuff it's got. And what do the studies show? It's not a question, well, this is the pill that I particularly like. Okay, so a particular clinician may have different combinations of hormonal methods that they slightly prefer because they see that they suit some of their women more, but they're not actually choosing them based on their own instincts in many ways. Or they're not keeping this method just purely for themselves. And I think this is the reason often why health professionals sort of dismiss fertility awareness, because either it's seen as something that's a very sort of has a strong religious bias and is actually quite anti-contraception, and being anti-contraception sometimes is actually quite outrageously inaccurate about health issues with contraception. That's not to say there are no side effects, obviously, but sometimes these seem to be the major complications that are extremely rare, that are put forward as something that is happening to every other woman. So I think we've got to make sure that a fertility awareness professionals are actually giving facts and not running down whether it's another fertility awareness based method or running down contraceptive methods.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely a fine line to walk on. I know for me doing the podcast, I talk a lot about hormonal birth control and I talk about the side effects, and I interview women who've had experiences with hormonal birth control. And so it's a fine line because I am not against the concept of preventing pregnancy. I want to have full control over that for myself. And I think every woman deserves to have control over it. But I think I see what you're saying, because it's kind of hard to be a fertility awareness professional who's also talking about contraceptives in a very critical way, because you don't want someone to feel like you're saying, I don't agree with the concept of contraception. So I really liked what you talked about with regards to, like, kind of imagine if there was an agreement between all of the fertility awareness educators. And it was really focused on, like you said, I really like the way you put it, because you said, we do have certain very specific indicators that are what all of the methods are based on. So all of the methods of fertility awareness, from my understanding, are fundamentally based on the interactions of these different fertile signs that we can monitor and pay attention to and record. And the question kind of comes down to, like, how are we going to record them and what's the most efficient way of doing that? And that out of that comes all the different methods. But maybe we could speak to those signs. Like, we could start with cervical mucus, for example, the cervical secretions, and talk about what the research has to say about that and why we can take that and use it effectively to prevent pregnancy.
I mean, essentially, the research on that says, and again, it depends whose research you're looking at, because anyone that has a vested interest, if you like, or totally believes that you only need to use secretions to identify both the beginning and the end of the fertile time, would probably have you believe that actually that is going to give a highly, highly effective method. And although some researchers may say that it does, but I think all the good research would tend to say that you need a combination of indicators for both the start and the end of the fertile time. So yes, it makes sense, and biologically it's obvious, it's absolutely clear that what's happening is the secretions at the cervix are changing, and as the estrogen levels are rising, as the follicles grow, you're getting a much more sort of sperm-friendly secretion. And if it was possible to identify that really precisely, and all women had that understanding right from day one, or pretty well, then that would be fine. You could rely on that change from the dryness into the start of that slight stickiness, or seeing a little bit of sticky white secretion. You could rely on that change. But the vast majority of women, especially when they're learning, certainly will not get that change early enough. And you can see that in studies again and again, and certainly where if you bring in a calculation such as a calendar calculation prior to that, pregnancies will be avoided in comparison with allowing women, because it's such a subjective indicator, to determine the start of the fertile time based purely on the secretions.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to think about it, because I remember in my Facebook community, a woman was talking about that, because I think she had been trained in one of the mucus only methods, and I think it might have been Billings. And what I found, because I work with women, I teach women to chart their cycles. That's a big part of what I do. And what I found after working with a couple hundred women is that there's a lot of really specific situations that exist today that probably didn't exist when these methods were first developed. So women being on hormonal birth control for 20 years, for example, or 15 years. Women having had a persistent HPV infection that then resulted in them having to have cervical surgery. Which then impacts their ability to secrete cervical mucus. And then also women having a lot of serious health issues. For example, I've worked with women who have some sort of mucus all the time, or so there's a lot of complexities for me as an educator. So I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this as well. I like having as many tools in my tool belt as as possible. And so I find that with some women, cervical mucus is great, and we can actually use that only if we want to. Although my preference is to add temperature for a lot of different reasons. But for a small percentage of women, the mucus actually isn't helpful either, because they don't have any. That's actually, I think, the most challenging, I would say. For my clients that don't have any or have very, very little, often we have to add another sign or two.
And that's why I think we should really be looking at tailoring the method to the woman, and tailoring that method specifically to her and her own biology, also her needs for how imperative it is that she avoids pregnancy, or she may be more relaxed and therefore maybe may be quite comfortable just to rely, for example, just on secretions. She may feel that she's able to rely on a very simplified method, such as a standard days type method or even a 2-day method. And it depends a lot on her as an individual woman or them as a couple. I think, if you look back through history, and I know the Billings ovulation method now, purely looking at secretions, but when John Billings first started out with this, he was using temperature. They brought in the secretions. They were also using a calendar calculation. They were, on top of that, they were also using some test tape, which was actually looking at the acidity, alkalinity of the vagina. They were using all those factors together. Now, as it happened, they decided to just switch, and they decided that women could rely just purely on the secretions. Now, what I would say is some women can, yes, but many can't. And as you said, for very many different reasons. And I think this is why it's important that women are given all the information about the different indicators and see for themselves what seems to work for them. And that can include, if you like, using a monitor such as Persona, try paralleling a monitor, or even just doing an LH predictor kit or something, an ovulation type predictor kit, to see how well that the symptoms correlate and get an idea about what seems to be the most effective method for that woman.
Well, and I think so. It's really interesting because I interviewed Dr. Mary Lee Barron, and she talked about the Marquette method.
Yeah.
And so, the Marquette method uses the Clear Blue fertility monitor. And so
yes.
That monitor, it's not like a LH kit. It actually monitors your levels of estrogen. So it actually, it gives you an indication via the monitor of when you enter into your fertile window. And there is research behind that showing, and that is another example of a situation where if a woman's mucus is really hard for her to interpret, or for whatever reason, it's just not helping her. That for many couples is a great way for them to then kind of just forget about the mucus altogether.
Absolutely, yeah.
And rely on the actual surge of estrogen.
And I think the Marquette are using that very effectively. I mentioned Persona, but they're using the Clear Blue monitor purely because they don't get Persona. They can't get Persona.
Is Persona? So sorry, I've never heard of it. Is Persona basically the same thing?
Persona's a UK version. I think it's in Germany and a few other countries as well. The US. So the only real difference is that it's based on estrogen and the picking up the rise in estradiol and LH as well. The only difference really is that the way the monitor is set and the levels that it picks up. So the Persona is designed for avoiding pregnancy, whereas the monitor that they're using with the Marquette method is actually designed for planning pregnancy. So I forget what the number of days it is, but they bring in another factor, and I think they also use the idea of day 6 or whatever as well. So they've got other factors to get around the idea that their monitor is more specifically for identifying the most fertile time for planning pregnancy.
I see. Yeah. Well, and so I think what you said is really helpful as well. If women have a good understanding of what the signs are and why they work. So for instance, cervical mucus is an indication of your hormone levels. So for a woman who has a really healthy, normal cervix and has just perfectly average and normal cervical mucus observations, the mucus is reflecting the hormones. So if you get that, then you realize that, well, if you find a monitor that is appropriate, and if you find a method that utilizes that, like the Marquette, or as you mentioned, the other type of monitor, but if you are trained by somebody who has taught by someone who's been trained in that method, and you understand what you're getting is basically the same idea. The mucus and the monitor are telling you the same information. They're telling you when your estrogen levels are rising so that you know you're approaching ovulation.
Yeah. So essentially, I think, what we're doing is just making sure that there is a backup. So if you like, there's a double check at both to find the start of the fertile time and the end of the fertile time. If we're relying just on one indicator, all the evidence clearly shows that it is going to be less effective than if you've got a backup. Okay, which makes sense because so often, if all you need, and, I've seen it, obviously I've been teaching for for donkey's years now. And, you see this, somebody goes off on holiday or something, and guess what? They've been scuba diving and they don't notice the change in secretions or something, So you got to just think about that having this extra backup is going to be, so much more effective.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so I appreciate the cervical position, and I appreciate that it's not every woman doesn't want to check her cervix every day.
Mm-hmm.
But what I appreciate about it is, what I encourage my clients to do is to check it for one full month, like one full cycle.
Yep.
If you want to. I mean, it's obviously all optional. But if you want to do that so that you get this understanding of what's happening. And then in those times when you go scuba diving and you can't appreciate your mucus, you at least have this additional piece of information. So I really like that message that you're sharing, Jane, because I feel like it is really important. At the end of the day, this isn't about what method you use and exactly, that's not what's important. What's important to me is empowering women to use this method effectively if that's what they want.
Yeah, and I think to use it intelligently, this is the thing. So I think if women are taught to understand, the different combination of indicators, then I think very quickly they'll decide that this is the one or this is the combination of the two that feels right. Some women never, ever get the hang of cervix, or they only sometimes they can tell height or softness, but some women really just don't get the hang of cervix, and others are brilliant cervix users because they've been, they may have had an IUD, or they may have been used to using a diaphragm or cervical cap, or just may get it, or their partner gets it, and that's brilliant. You're off to a great start when somebody's very familiar with their cervix. But that's not always the case. And as you said, I think, Lisa, which is right, there's going to be many women who, for either personal reasons or whatever, would not want to actually be feeling inside the vagina and checking the cervix.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I really appreciate your message, because basically it's in alignment with kind of one of the beliefs that I hold very closely, which is just that we really have to find ways that are going to work. Every woman is different. And so, every client that I work with is different. And I'm sure you found that too. And so some women gravitate to one thing where other women gravitate to a complete other thing. And it doesn't really matter. What matters is that you actually are getting what you want out of it. So maybe share with me, I think one of the topics that we even kind of briefly touched on in our pre-chat, with fertility awareness, I think that what I've found over the years is that many women, we all kind of, as soon as we learn about this as women, it's really groundbreaking, and it's incredible to think that all this stuff is happening every cycle and no one tells us about it, right? Mm-hmm. It's only when they happen to meet someone like you or like me who has taken the time to train in this, and then they're like, wow, I had no idea this was all going on. But as women, we're taught that our cycles are supposed to be intuitive. So there's a sense that really, you just read half of a book and then you're an expert. So maybe talk to us about some of the things that because you mentioned, for women to use this method effectively and to have the high effectiveness rate, there's all these different factors that contribute. So from your perspective, have you found, do you think women can learn this effectively from a book? If so, why, or in what situations versus others? How can a woman use this method effectively?
I think the important thing to realize here is when we look at effectiveness studies, they are generally done under study conditions, using experienced teachers, using standardized teaching protocols, using highly motivated clients very often, and also with quite strict follow-up. Okay. And when someone's on a study, then you can kind of insist that you see them and you can follow them up. When you're in real life conditions, it can be very different. And you can find that someone comes along for one session and they may disappear, and they may think that they're using natural family planning or fertility awareness, but actually they're just not doing anything. They're just not using their pills anymore. And so I think, again, how you actually structure that training to get people back again, you have to look at the value of someone having a single session, but they are then quite vulnerable to go away and actually kind of do it themselves. I'm a great believer that people can read things for themselves. We did a study back in the 1980s where we looked at the time that was needed, the time and the cost of teaching, because one thing that health professionals always say is it's too costly. You can't teach this because, the educational process takes takes a long time. Yes, it does take a long time. Therefore, we have to look at ways that we can actually reduce that time, which is why we were using, at one stage, we were using sort of audiovisual aids. We were using, obviously, books to support and so on, because women can read materials for themselves. And now with the web, I mean, and podcasts and goodness knows what else, that there's plenty of opportunity for information, which is why in many ways women are flooded by the information and they've got too much to even begin to make sense of. And it can seem like an absolute minefield once you start to go into the whole realms of it. You know, we haven't even really talked about apps, but there's just literally hundreds of thousands of apps that are offering you this same kind of information just at the click of a button, or, you know, hold on to it on your phone. And, you know, the vast majority with absolutely no evidence at all to support the use of that app, even though they might be based on a methodology that has validity to it. That methodology is tested out under study conditions, which are very different from someone doing this for themselves on an app and actually not going through the entry criteria to go into a study.
Mm-hmm. I recently did an interview, or not an interview. I recently released an episode about apps, and I kind of weighed in. So I'm a little bit biased as a fertility awareness educator. I'm not all about the apps. I think that apps. So in my opinion, right? Like, but my opinion is that apps should be a place to enter your data. And I worry when women actually begin to rely on an app to tell them when they're fertile. And I posed the question in my community, my online community. And what I found was that there was quite like the majority of women were kind of who are all into fertility awareness, very enthusiastic, are saying, well, I don't really, trust the app to predict my fertile window. Women were saying, I like to use the predictor because it's kind of fun to see like how off it is or how, if it gets it right. And then there is a small percentage of women that will say like, well, I actually, they're seeking out the devices that are saying that they are birth control, that are saying that they have research behind them. And a lot of women actually really like those devices. So where do you stand and how do you feel about this whole concept of an app as birth control?
I think apps, clearly, there's absolutely no doubt, apps could and should be the way forward. I just don't think we've got there yet. To a certain extent, it's relatively easy to set some kind of algorithm to do things like look for 3 high temperatures over 6 and so on. But we've got to remember that women are not machines. Women's bodies will vary from cycle to cycle. So many factors, so many disturbances, and nobody yet, although there is some research, and certainly the German team are doing some research now, to look at how apps respond to different disturbances. We don't have any of that information yet. So the idea of relying on them, and I think, it's great that your community are saying, yes, we love inputting the information into an app. I couldn't agree more. It's a really nice, handy way of documenting it compared with endless bits of paper or whatever else it is. And it's always with you and it's brilliant. And you talk to someone and they immediately produce their phone and they can give you their period dates. And that's fantastic. But the big but here, I think, is the fact that if you're talking to, if you like, your community being an informed community, that by definition they're listening to the podcasts and so on, they are the sort of, if you like, they're the informed group. I think it's so many women, and this again is where things get a very bad press, are just sort of downloading any app because it's very hard to tell from a good one from a bad one. The ones that are best marketed are not necessarily going to be the ones that are going to be the most effective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I mean, I think as an educator, I come from that very particular perspective where for me, this was always about empowerment. I remember how I felt. So I discovered fertility awareness very young. I was about 18 years old at the time, and I'm 35 now. So I've been doing this for 17 years. And so for me, I found it to be this incredible just empowerment because we had never been taught about this kind of stuff in school. So this was my way to finally understand my body. And I've been able to chart through all the different life fluctuations. I've had different, health and endocrine issues that kind of changed the length of my cycle. And I've had 2 children over the years. So I've been able to navigate very successfully this method of birth control over the course of my adult life throughout all of these changes. So I feel like I'm, like when you're talking to your grandmother or like, someone who's older and wiser than you, I feel like in many ways, because I've been doing this for so long, it's like the cautionary tale. I want to tell women, just like what you said, there are so many different reasons your cycle could fluctuate. And if you really want to use this method, like for your whole adult life, you're going to have to actually learn it. Even if you want to use an app, right? Like use the app, but you're going to have to actually learn it so that you can negotiate and navigate the times when your cycle is not predictable.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the only way. And I think to give the idea that it's very simple and doesn't involve, anything other than sort of a minute of your time a day, I think is misleading, because actually it involves a lot of bodily awareness, a lot of general, or certainly a very, very close supervision with an experienced practitioner. I think that's, it's vital that there is that, but it also involves, I don't necessarily think it's linked to education. I don't think you have to be the brightest spark. And in fact, certainly, I've taught for many, many years in Oxford and, have many a tale of the most high-flying professors that can really make a complete mess of this, because sometimes they overcomplicate it and they try and, basically do things like sort of working out the average of all the temperatures, the means and the medians and all the rest of it. And actually, it's a very simple system. You just essentially have to do as you're told. And sometimes the sort of young girl walking in that you might think, first thoughts, is she likely to be an appropriate user? It may be entirely appropriate because she's motivated. She doesn't have to be that bright, but she is prepared to listen and to do what she's told, essentially, and follow a set of guidelines. So, I think and certainly when you look at the much more simplified methods, it is something that could be open to people of all walks of life and all abilities.
Well, I think your example is really interesting because I'm curious. I'm trying to think of how to ask this question, but I find that sometimes it's easy to overcomplicate it. So fertility awareness, it's not, the concept itself is very, very easy to understand.
Sure.
I think we can put that out there. The actual practice of it, I like to compare it to learning how to drive standard. I feel like that's a good analogy because at first you have to put in some time and it feels awkward. It does not feel like, it doesn't feel natural, even though we're talking about the menstrual cycle and that's supposed to be natural. It doesn't exactly feel natural. But then after you've done it, because the thing about the cycle that I often tell my clients, especially my clients who are just learning it, they're in their first couple of months of ever charting, your cycle just keeps on going. And so once you get to the point that you've had like 50 of these, it just gets a lot simpler. So where do you see people kind of going wrong? So if the method is not working for somebody, if they're having a pregnancy that's not planned or something, just they're not getting it, or like, what do you think is kind of like the biggest challenge for women learning this method?
I would say the biggest challenge is always going to be stress. The impact of the stress on the cycle, it's so varied. It's enormously varied. And that stress could either be a sort of quite an acute stress, the loss of it could be whether it's the loss of a pet or the loss of a partner. Obviously the partner being highly significant, but the pet can also be a hugely distressing event. So it's the stresses, or it's just the long-term, the cumulative chronic stress. It's these things that I think sometimes they're more insidious, and it can be weight changes. It can be all sorts of things. So, someone that's suboptimal weight and they've just dropped and their cycles are just starting to do slightly strange things. They're not keeping abreast of that. So they're not amending things based on that. I think definitely I would say stress is one of the biggest things. The second, so that would be, as you said, major life changes or changes of fertility status, the post-breastfeeding, obviously moving from lactational amenorrhea back into using a fertility awareness method. Not an easy time. Certainly, once periods come back, but still breastfeeding can be a notoriously difficult time. And similarly, coming off hormones as well. Anyone that's been onto hormones, even short length of time or going on to emergency pills, and anyone that sort of goes into this thinking, well, if if I think I've made a mistake, I can use an emergency pill. That's not going to work out very well because they can cause a lot of disruption.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, it's any of these things really just kicking in.
Mm-hmm. Well, and for one of the things that we talked a little bit about before we started the interview, once there's a certain percentage of women who discover fertility awareness and, like me or like yourself, become very enthralled with it, and just it kind of takes over. So you begin to want to teach other women and tell other women. It's kind of like it just chooses some of us. But I think, especially at the early stages, it's easy to underestimate the complexities of actually teaching other women to do this. So I know there's many women who listen to this podcast who've fully gone on to do educator training of their own and really wanting to spread the word. And I think it's amazing because, of course, that's what we need. We need more women talking about this. Yep. And so for the woman who's listening who is really passionate about this and really wants to share the message with other women, wants to teach other women, what would you want her to know before she goes out and starts teaching?
I would want her to realize that her own experience is quite unique, and the fact that the relationship with the partner and the way they manage their sexual behavior during the fertile time, whether that's abstinence, whether it's using barriers and so on, these are all quite unique characteristics for her as a woman and them as a couple. And I think what I would be cautious against is having this incredible sort of zeal, if you like, of taking it out there to the masses and convincing people who actually are not quite in that place. And I think it is just recognizing that people, I think, essentially almost need to find it for themselves, discover it for themselves, and certainly not have it sort of kind of thrust on them in whichever way.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. And I know that it's often frustrating for women who discover fertility awareness and are really excited about in that stage where it's all new, it's all exciting. You are really wanting to tell the whole world, only to realize that the world doesn't want to hear about it. And your friends don't really care.
Yes.
And so I don't know if you found yourself in that situation or if you've supported, clients or, educators who you've taught through that situation. But what is your advice on how to kind of deal with that type of situation?
Certainly I have a lot of people that have literally just learned the method and then they say something similar to what you said earlier. How can I now want to teach it? I know for myself, now I want to teach it. And you can just sense that this is really not going to be a good idea. I'm not saying that you have to be a health professional to teach, but I think there's a huge difference between learning something for yourself and going out and teaching. And it is all about respecting where that other person is coming from rather than doing it based on your own experience. And this is one of the concerns, I think, with non-professionals is that there's so much of their time to, up until that stage is based on their own experience and not looking at the wider picture. Whereas health professionals have obviously seen women, in all states, if you like, and they're not doing things based on their own experience. Having said that, I honestly think that women that are users themselves genuinely do often make incredibly good instructors because they understand the method with the depth that many health professionals that certainly if they're doing that as literally just another method, then they would be lacking in something. So certainly when we're training professionals, we would want them to record their own cycles to understand quite how that works, how it feels just on the day-to-day basis, and all the pitfalls that go with it.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that is one of the most interesting aspects of this to me, which is that women often are like already out the door to teach before they fully understand how to chart.
Yeah. Yes.
And so when women come to me and they want to skip the part where they have to learn it themselves. Yeah. Because they think they know.
Absolutely, but I think there's also that feeling that that sort of, in many ways, the anger at the world of having reached, for so many women, it's like, well, I'm now 32 and I've only just learned this. And the frustration, and therefore so often people say, but we should be doing this in schools, and I want to go out and tell 13-year-olds about it and so on. And mostly 13-year-olds aren't kind of ready to listen.
Well, I mean, I would hope. I mean, the way I've had a lot of time to think about what what this would look like for teenagers and that
Yep.
type of thing. And I feel like what a 13-year-old needs to know, because we're gonna tell a 13-year-old about her period so
Sure.
that she can expect that.
And
And I
the
think
changes in the secret. No, I think there's
we
a
need to
lot you
tell
can
her
teach a
about cervical
13-year-old.
mucus so that she
Absolutely.
knows
Yeah.
that there are two things to watch for in her cycle. And even
Yeah.
just that
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
make the world
A
a different place.
general the awareness. Yes, this is not about a methodology. This is about bodily awareness, and that's of enormous value for young people. And then you build on that as time goes on.
Mm-hmm.
So it then can become a method, whether it's for planning or avoiding pregnancy. If our young people had a much better level of education through school about the menstrual cycle, about the impact of the menstrual cycle and how it feels, then I think we'd be in a much easier position in terms of teaching as a methodology.
Mm-hmm. Well, and back to the teaching for a moment. I'm sure you found this as well, but we even kind of touched on this earlier. So you think that you're going to be teaching women how to chart. And when you first learn about it, especially if you're reading about it in a book, it makes perfect sense. Women have these 28-day cycles. There's like a couple days of mucus, right? Ovulation. But what we actually see in the world is that a lot of women have a lot of health challenges that are negatively impacting their cycles. A lot of women have histories of hormonal birth control that affects their cycle, even if it's a temporary effect for, a year or two after they come off of them. And so what I've seen through working with women is that you really need to get yourself trained if you want to teach, because you think women are coming to you and saying like, oh, I want to learn. But really, they're having challenges with their cycles and they want some support. Like they want to figure out how to, just some support to figure out what's going on. And that is something you require training for.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is for anyone that is a non-health professional that wants to train and wants to educate women, absolutely vital that they are very much referring women back to their doctors, their gynecologists or their general practitioners. This is why I said a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, whether it's kind of just getting this slight misunderstanding about things that are related to gynecological issues or so on. So it is making sure that you're working with the health professionals as well, rather than a sort of us and them situation.
I couldn't agree more with you there, because I think we have this interesting stage of like with the internet coming out and like you can Google everything. And so everyone has like a little bit of knowledge. And, I always I encourage all of my clients who like you can clearly see that there are certain issues. I think of my role as helping them to identify and understand and educate. But ultimately, like, you need to have a health professional to support you if you have an actual endocrine disorder or some sort of gynecological condition. And even if you have something, like even if you can see on a chart something, you still need to have that confirmed and potentially treated depending on what the condition is. So I couldn't agree more. I think that's why it's important to be trained, because somewhere in the training process would be that kind of like ethical understanding of what your role is in this
Absolutely.
space. Well, and this is a relatively new field, right? The fertility awareness education field. And I think that it's really, even when I first graduated through my program, I had to really figure out what my role was in this process. And I think that this is a really important conversation to have. And I agree with what you said, that this shouldn't be an us versus them. And I've definitely, at points of my life within this community, I've definitely gotten that sense that it's like us versus them and you can't trust your physician, all this kind of stuff. And ultimately, this podcast has been a fantastic way for me to connect with different professionals and to really get a sense that we are actually all working towards pretty much the same goals. And so if we can work together and support women, then it's just better. You need to have a doctor. You often need to have a naturopath. And it is helpful if you want to learn to chart. You need to have an instructor, because through that process, that's how you really get fully supported.
Absolutely. Yeah. And really important role to actually be spending that time, focused time with women, to be educating them in all those aspects is really important, but recognizing those boundaries.
Yes, absolutely. I think this is a great conversation, because I don't think this specific topic has ever come up on the show. And especially knowing that there's a large kind of I don't know if it's large, but there's definitely a percentage of women who listen to the show who are really inspired to go on to teach. And I think this kind of grounds the discussion in, what your role is, what you're there to do, and how can you best support women, and having those boundaries around it. So I'm really glad that we kind of hashed that out today.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Well, as we kind of bring our interview to a close, given everything that we talked about today, what is that one thing that you would want the listener to leave from our conversation today?
I think I would say think about indicators, look at specific indicators, and just look at tailoring things to individual women rather than necessarily doing something that is a certain approach. Would be a more, for the majority of women, I think would be a more acceptable way of teaching.
I love that. It's kind of like looking at the real world and actually working within what things are really like,
Sure.
Instead of what you wish they were like.
What you'd like it to be like. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Love that. Jane, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was a lot of fun.
Good to talk to you, Lisa. All the best.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/210. I hope that you enjoyed my episode with Jane. It was such a treat to have her on the show. It's always really nice to talk with other fertility awareness professionals, especially fertility awareness professionals that are operating in different parts of the world. I think it's always really, really neat to hear different perspectives and just it's very encouraging also to connect with women who are doing this important work of sharing with other women how to chart their cycles and how to feel confident using this method for birth control and how to start making those connections between what you're seeing in your cycle and your overall health. So for more information about Jane and the work that she does, especially if you live in the UK and you may be local to her, you can head over to fertilityuk.org. That's fertilityuk.org. I'll also link that information in the show notes page. And we'll also link in the show notes page to her book, The Complete Guide of Fertility Awareness. So, my copy came from Amazon. So if you have access to Amazon, you can actually go and, her book is available in all the major retailers, but I know for sure it's available on Amazon as well. And whether you have just discovered fertility awareness recently or whether you've been charting your cycles for a little while, if you haven't grabbed a copy of my free 3-part video series for FAM 101, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAM101. So that's fertilityfriday.com/FAM, FAM 101, the number. And so in that video, I put it together at the beginning of the year because I wanted to create a resource so that when you're discovering fertility awareness for the first time and it all feels a little bit overwhelming, you at least have one resource that you can just go to and kind of have the rundown all in one place. And so even if you've been charting your cycles for a while, you'll appreciate that time that I took to kind of go into detail on the 3 main fertile signs and also providing resources to support you in, this journey of discovering your menstrual cycle, charting it, developing body literacy. So again, that's fertilityfriday.com/FAM101. And this is the last call. So last call to join us in Fertility Awareness Mastery in July. If you are wanting to be there, this is it. This is like, if you're waiting for the last minute, this is the last minute. So fertilityfriday.com/group program if you want to join us in there. And I just want to thank you so much for spending some time with me today. There are literally like thousands. I wonder how many podcasts there are, but there's like hundreds of thousands of podcasts. And you are taking the time to listen to mine. And so I really appreciate that. I also really appreciate all of you for sharing the show with your friends, for spreading the word, and really just telling more and more women about body literacy and fertility awareness. Ultimately, this is how it's going to happen. Change happens. It's like the game of telephone, like worldwide, where we tell our friends and our friends tell their friends, and eventually, as women, there's going to be a tipping point. I feel like we're making our way. I still think we're a little bit a ways from that actual tipping point, but I feel like it's building. And all of you as part of the Fertility Friday community are part of that movement. And all of you who get really excited about fertility awareness and really passionate about it and go out there. So many women I've talked to have decided to go on to practitioner training and have decided to start holding little, circles in your community to share this information with women and just doing your part, making your contribution to share this information with more and more women. That is how the change is going to happen. That is how how women are going to learn fertility awareness, because as of today, it's still not in schools. No, women are not learning about this in their junior high school, sex ed classes, unless you are listening and you are a sex ed teacher and you teach it. Other than that, we're still kind of where we were. At least there's the internet, because when I was growing up, there was no internet. So we are further ahead. But at the end of the day, this change is going to happen like one woman at a time. So I just want to thank you for being part of this community, for being part of this movement. And, as always, be well. Until next time, be well and happy charting.